Am I still Jewish? He says, yes. He talks about the Torah and the Talmud, and then finally he says, Rabbi, I'm not even circumcised. Am I still Jewish? And the rabbi said, yes, you're Jewish. And he said, how could that really be? I have sort of really gone against the grain of what the concept itself stands for. And the question is if you're really Jewish. I tell my students, when we talk about question, think about it. It's quest plus ION. So when you ask a question, it literally means really that you are on a quest, a search for something. And that is what I think we have really been doing. Now, when we talk about the concept of Somali, here's what I always really talk about. Two kinds of discourses. The discourses of the nation and the discourses of the state. And we have to really differentiate between these two. In other words, the discourse of the nation is hermeneutic for me. Hermeneutic in the sense that it is the idea, the text of the concept of Somali Nimo and the Somali person, which literally means a text when we say, even the etymology of the word itself says taxere. And taxere in Latin means to weave. So it is a kind of really a process of weaving, but weaving in the sense that the idea itself is always a process. It's never really is for me. Now, the discourse of the state, though, is different. The discourse of the state is basically, for me, what I call it's rhetorical in the true sense of the word. What does that mean? If I were asked to explain it in terms of a kind of Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian critic, who in the dialogic imagination talks about two kinds of discourses, he says. One that's called authoritarian enforced discourse, as opposed to an internally persuasive discourse. Authoritarian enforced discourse is the one that we, when we go to school, when we go to the mosque, when we go with our parents, this is what they taught us. And in the process, we sort of really, not necessarily internalized it, but we accepted it. Then comes at a point when we ourselves start to understand, question, and then form of an internally persuasive discourse. And I think Somali could survive if we all sort of questioned, understood it, and internally sort of developed a persuasive discourse. Because I have 20 minutes, and I have about 12 pages, I have to sort of make sure. Now, Somali then, for me, the word itself, Somali Somaliness, it is an adjective, for example, which really means of or belonging. It is about the character, for example, if I say Somali Bana, or the other song that you carry, but there's a trouble there, because if you sort of think about the operative terms, three important operatives: we, gender, in which case no girls to begin with. Two, we are talking about gay, which is really very important. I call it the Pontiac of the desert, and it's really very important, gay. But now, how would those of us who are in this room, who are not really hungry after all, we have something to eat, we have no gain, we are not necessarily, we're not all of us sort of boys, how do we find ourselves explicated, inscribed in that sort of concept? And therein lies the importance of identity in the sense, of course, its characteristics, the hair, the customary laws, which have their bases in Islamic precepts. And it's really important to always remember that in all societies and all religions have sort of thrived this idea of syncretism after all. Syncretism in the sense that early on when religions come, what they do is they accommodate concepts, characteristics, certainties that existed before the religion came to the place. And this is called syncretism. Now, you will sort of, if you think in the case of where I come from now, Halloween, for example, where this was a pagan ritual for the saints. And the idea basically was Christianity. And now what you do is you domesticate it. And you domesticate it in the sense that you defang it, in which case it no longer has the paganistic sort of qualities of its past. And syncretism then becomes important. And for us, it's also really important. Now, when we talk about identity, identity then, as I said before, is always relational, dynamic, and dialogical. And if that were really the case here, what I, in a way, propose that we do when we talk about Somaliness is to unsettle the hermeneutic and interpretive intent and horizon of those inherited analytic categories. Two, we have to analyze what is in the Somali collective memory and critically examine the various strands that shape and inform what Benedict Anderson calls, quote, the embryo of the nationally imagined community, unquote. Three, we have to reflect on the constituent parts of the givens of Somali living, in the sense of social, political, ethical existence. But at the same time also, we have to really think about how those concepts themselves came to unravel. Four, we have to juxtapose the internalized, as I said before, and the externalized constituent elements of Somali and Somali Nimo and Somali cultural identity. What does this mean? Somali Nimo for me literally means, there's this African-American writer, Bell Hooks, and there was something that she said was really important. She said, we were not, she says, we were a community, she says, not because we were black, but because what we did together. And that lies the importance. We were not black, we were black, not because we were black, but because what we did together. And therein lies the importance of Somali Nimo for me. What does it mean then? What it means is it has to become expansive. There are people who are on the margins, who have not really, who do not see themselves or their ideals and their aspirations reflected from this so-called sacred center of Somali. Here you are talking about all kinds of Somalis who are really on the margins. And I will be talking about this shortly. I wrote a poem not long ago in which I'm talking about what I call, the title of the poem was The Clan, the Nation, and the World. In my latest book, When Donkeys Give Birth to Cows. And the poetic, what happened was I said, Iskudume, molder of nations, where are you now? Professor Muhammad Eno, really a brilliant scholar and poet, who's a professor in Abu Dhabi, wrote a book, but in that book of his, there was a poem called In Celebration of Harmony, in which he interrogates, and what he did basically was he threw the question back at me, and he says, quote, in his poem, who morality based on morality without ethnicity when this molder of nations that you are talking about comes around? How am I going to read find myself in that sacred center of Somali women. Now, and I'll conclude here. So I can really cheat. Yes. Back speaking of the double time. No, I'm kidding. What we really have to think about is, in a way, Somali can exist, and it does exist. We have a multiplicity of states. We have to differentiate between a state, a government, Somaliland and Somalia, for example. We have to differentiate between that concept and the concept of Somaliland. Somaliland is why we are here tonight. And that this is a proof that Somaliland truly exists. What I would like us to sort of, especially in the 20th, before the election was, I'm sort of going back and forth in the sense of for those of us in diaspora, I think we could really play a prominent role in fostering a new form of Somali in the absence of a strong state. The new Somali Nimo could be had, I think, and other forms of art and events like this. There are literary and cultural websites all over, especially the ones that I'm really interested in, not the ones that talk about politics. The ones, I am a cultural historian. I'm not a historian, I'm a historian buff. The real historian is here. So what I'm interested in is in terms of culture, in the sense, and there are certain websites, Afmal, for example, Hoyga, Suganta, Lashin, for example, and I think we have to sort of give some kind of support to these websites. For this project, though, to succeed, we also need a new covenant, one that rethinks the foundations upon which stand familiar, clan, and feelings of Somaliness. Now, here is where I will end. If you would kind of excuse me, and I end with a poem of mine, which, and it's called Of Nations and Narratives. And what I honestly believe is, creating a nation is sort of similar to creating and writing novels. Of Nations and Narratives. And the poem, it was published in 2002 in my book, Fear is a Coward. The poem, here it goes, and I'll end. Michael, I promise you. It says, happy endings are not concocted nor delivered in a C-section. They must germinate in the belly of the narrative and have their fate woven exquisitely in the womb of the poet.
Thank you very much, Professor. In fact, you're a very prompt and courteous speaker because you spoke exactly 1 minute. You ended 1 minute earlier than I was anticipating anyway. So you were not outstanding. You're welcome at all. Thank you. I'd like to invite now Nadifa Mohammed to say a few words. And I think you wanted this photo behind you, didn't you? Is that?
It's a video.
Video. Do you want me to play the video? Okay.
Hi everyone. Great to see you all outside. I'm concentrating on the Somali British and historical idea of Somali Nimo, especially in the context of the Somali seamen that lived here from the 1860s, 70s onwards. I'm writing a novel at the moment about Mahmoud Matan, who was the last man executed in Cardiff jail for a murder he didn't commit in 1952. So Mahmoud was born in Hargeisa. He arrived in the UK in 1947, carried on going to sea for some time, and then decided to settle permanently with his Welsh wife Laura in Cardiff, despite much prejudice and discrimination shown towards them. So his life kind of hit a difficult period of time when he was accused of this murder. And I've often been thinking while writing about the book, why didn't he go back to Somalia? He had the option of returning as a working sailor and taking a ship to Aden and never coming back. But he didn't. So I've been investigating the lives of Somali seamen since then. Somalis started arriving in Britain in the mid-1860s after the opening of the Suez Canal. Most worked in the engine rooms of merchant navy steamships, stoking coal on the routes to Aden, India and the Far East. The temperatures in the engine rooms reached such heights that it was seen as an unsuitable and undesirable job for white British seamen. So the work was done by Yemenis, Somalis and some Indians. They were paid a fraction of the wage that British seamen received and had no opportunity to move up the ranks. There were also some Somalis working in the Royal Navy, and even a few who arrived in Britain as part of human zoos, where large groups of up to 100, maybe even more than 100, often family groups, clan groups, would be taken across Europe on a many-year tour, and they would perform in zoos, in theatres, in fields, and it was a kind of ethnographic show where people wanted to see how Somalis lived, how they cooked, how they taught their children Islam or reading and writing. There were beauty contests, there were kind of Olympic games put on between the various ethnic groups that were touring at the same time. So Somalis were appearing in Britain in various ways, but the vast majority were seamen in the merchant navy. The Somalis generally settled in South Wales, in East London, South Shields, Hull and Liverpool. They had to live in boarding houses established by the shipping companies because often no one would rent them a room. So they were huddled together, not only in one district, but in particular homes within this district. And the boarding houses were organised on clan lines, and different clans lived in different parts of the country. So it was still a very bill-orientated way of life for many of them. But from everything I've heard speaking to old sailors, there was never any tension or hostility between clan groups. The boarding houses served as social centres, places that would help you find work, and they would operate as banks where you could store money until you returned. There were cafes. They were, during the 1919 race riots across Britain, often war zones as well, where angry, demobilised British soldiers and civilians would attack the Somali boarding houses as well as the Arab ones and of any kind of ethnic minority. So in Cardiff, for example, one man, a Bosnian man, had a boarding house in the white part of town, and that was besieged, and Somalis defended it and received serious injuries, and from that point onwards, all of the ethnic minorities huddled together in Butte Town by the docks as a form of safety, but also it became a very confident and cosmopolitan part of Cardiff where it had its own identity. People intermarried. There were Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Chinese, Eastern Europeans, South Americans, everyone would go there. The Aliens Order Act of 1925 and the British Shipping Act of 1935 had exclusionary and very difficult impacts on the lives of Somali seamen. They were forced to take whatever job they were offered once they reached the top of the quota. One Muslim sailor described it as being, he said, you were in a slave market and you had no protection whatever. The British Union of Seamen was very hostile. The National Union of Seamen was very hostile to foreign sailors and would often encourage the government to deport them. And they would play off white sailors against the ethnic minorities, saying that the ship owners were using them to lower their wages. The Somalis and the Yemenis would work for nothing. They had no, they lived like pigs. They would say that they can live off the smell of an oily rag for a week while we can't because we have English values. It's just lots of hostility as well as competition. Few jobs were available to non-white crews. They were given heavier duties and often bribery to find work was common. This had another impact on the Somali scene where it divided those who were willing to work under these conditions and those that weren't. In Cardiff and other Bristol Channel ports, there were violent confrontations with sticks and umbrellas, and many people were convicted and sent to jail for hard labour to do with these uprisings. To deal with the difficult situation that they were living in, the poverty and often sometimes destitution that they were facing, different clans organised in different ways. The Weli, they set up a fund established from voluntary contributions of £1 per person per voyage that was charged on returning seamen to help the ones that were still in port. Sometimes they came together in social and self-help groups which had a different focus, either ethnic or religious. And beyond that, sometimes they even joined more comprehensive organisations to assert their rights, such as the more militant Minority Seamen's Union, to struggle more effectively against discrimination from employers, unions, city authorities, as well as the state. In the wake of the British Shipping Assistance Act of 1935, a defence committee, including Malays, Somalis and Arabs, were formed in Cardiff to assist it. And in the late 1930s, the Islamia Alawiya Friendly Society was set up for the purpose of providing a meeting place for Muslim seamen and aimed at uniting all members of the Muslim community in the port. As the situation deteriorated during the Great Depression in the 1930s, the South Wales Association for the Welfare of Coloured People, the British Somali Society and the Somali Youth League were all established in Cardiff in the mid-1930s. In 1937, all three organisations united as the Somali Association of Great Britain, and realising that there were many socio-economic issues in which common cause could be made with other coloured people in Britain, it took part in the annual conference of the League of Coloured Peoples. Key members of the British Somali Society were Mohammed Saeed and Douala Mohammed, who closely collaborated with the local Communist Party. The Somali Association also dealt with welfare matters. Somalis had a problem of being separated by language from some ethnic groups and by religion from others. Just to go into more detail about one of the people I just mentioned, Douala Mohammed. He was born in Irigabo. He was given the nickname Aftar. He arrived in Cardiff in 1908 and continued to serve in the Merchant Navy for many decades, including during the First and Second World Wars, where the casualty rate for Somali as well as all seamen was very high in the Merchant Navy. He married a half-Irish, half-Brazilian woman and had 2 sons. Shortly after his arrival in Cardiff, Aftar perfected his English to an academic standard and learnt French because he was already interested in pursuing a diplomatic route for Somali independence. In the mid-1930s, Aftar became the head of the Somali Youth League in the UK, a movement responsible for Somali's independence. In 1939, he went to the League of Nations in New York to campaign for Somali independence alongside Abdullahi Isa. The Cardiff police watched him closely and described him as closely identified with communism. Policemen from Special Branch followed his movements around the country and intercepted his correspondence. He was also a poet and wrote the poem "Today I Am Born" to celebrate Somali independence in 1960. And it was one of the very first recited in Hargeysa's Freedom Park. Somalis also sought assistance from sympathetic organisations such as the League Against Imperialism and the National Council for Civil Liberties. They lobbied MPs and with their support attempted to squeeze concessions out of the government, but the changes generally were only cosmetic. Sylvia Pankhurst, the suffragette and anti-imperialist campaigner, was a close ally, using her position as editor of the New Times and Ethiopian News to lobby MPs, cabinet ministers and the League of Nations on behalf of individual Somalis in trouble, as well as Somali causes in a more general sense. Somali Nimo, in conclusion, was both a passionate ideal and a complicated idea to British Somalis. It was one identity amongst many that they wore. They were seamen, coloureds, Africans, Muslims, socialists, and did not fit in easily anywhere. Despite the importance of clan networks in their lives in the UK, they do not seem to have been politically or socially divided by clan, and instead were often trying to build an identity that was both British and Somali, regardless of the animosity they faced from state and society.
Thank you. Come on. Would you like to? Oh, do we want to watch the film? Because it relates to that. So I think, can I ask Nadifa maybe to introduce what we're going to watch while I get it sort of teed up?
It's a short film, 25 minutes, made by Daawo and Axmed's grandson. They were born in Hargeisa but moved to Cardiff and received funding from the National Theatre of Wales to make a short documentary about their grandfather.
It's going to take just a second for the projector to warm up again, so you can keep talking about it if you want.
What else? I've been going to National Archives a lot, and I'm surprised at how much scrutiny was put on Somali seamen, both in Mogadishu and Hargeisa as well as in the UK. They were seen as a threat, and it was often the communist links that they were perceived to have that were seen as the real threat. So Daawo Axmed as well, despite being pursued by special grants, he was never arrested, but Chinese seamen who were also trying to improve their lives in the UK by asking for equal pay and equal conditions in Liverpool, in 1947, 2,000 of them were deported en masse. Within 72 hours, they were not given a chance to say goodbye to their lives or their families or anyone. They just disappeared because of the threat that they were seen to pose in asking for equal treatment.
I know it looks as though nothing is happening, but actually I can see that the projector is coming alive. So in just a second, it's going to suddenly pop up there. When it does, it's just a very short film. I will turn the lights down, so anyone that's coming in, if you can seat yourselves, I will just turn the lights down so that we can see what's happening. I've still got faith that it's about to appear there. Although, there will be a point when I'll start losing that faith. Oh, there you go. My fault. Okay, so I'm just going to turn the lights off now, so if you don't mind just sort of spending the next few minutes in darkness. Oh, okay. That's the best I can do. Is that, hopefully everyone can see the screen. Is that okay? Ooh. Reduce the volume.
100 years of my family history began here in Tiger Bay, Cardiff. This was the multi-Tiger. Years of my family history began here in Tiger Bay, Cardiff. This was the multicultural community that my grandfather Daawo Axmed came as a seaman in 1908. He was more than a seaman. He played a crucial role in the liberation of his homeland.